The parties to the UNFCCC note that the largest share of historical and current global emissions of greenhouse gases has originated in developed countries, that the per capita emissions in developing countries are still relatively low, and that the share of global emissions originating in developing countries will grow to meet their social and developmental needs. As a result, the Convention puts the onus on developed countries to lead the way in combating climate change. In pursuance of this, the UNFCCC recognizes the countries of the world as Annex I or Non-Annex I countries. According to the UNFCCC, Annex I countries belong to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Group, or the OECD. These include 12 countries with economies in transition from Central and Eastern Europe as well. Non-Annex I countries are parties to the UNFCCC that are not listed in Annex I and comprise mostly of low-income developing countries. In particular, the difference between these two groups or categories of countries is that Annex I countries were expected to stabilize their greenhouse gas emissions at 1990 levels by the year 2000, and non-Annex I countries did not have any such legally binding targets to either reduce or limit their greenhouse gas emissions. Moving further, Article 3 of the UNFCCC provides the basis for another core principle of the climate change regime, that of the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Article 3.1 specifically says that parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Accordingly, the developed country parties should take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse effects thereof. Moving on, the UNFCCC lays down certain commitments on the developed country parties. In particular, according to Article 4.3 of the Convention, developed country parties and other developed parties included in Annex II of the Convention should provide financial support, including the transfer of technology to help support climate change activities in developing countries. We will study further about this particular point in the module on financial mechanisms and technology transfer. Moving on from the UNFCCC, we try and understand the origins of the Kyoto Protocol, the next major international legal instrument to address the problem of climate change. In 1995, the parties to the UNFCCC launched further negotiations to strengthen the global response to climate change after they realized that the emissions reduction provisions in the UNFCCC were proving to be inadequate. The UNFCCC, in a sense, was considered to be legally non-binding because it neither set mandatory limits on the greenhouse gas emissions for countries, nor did it contain any enforcement mechanisms. The UNFCCC, however, did allow for the adoption of additional protocols to the Convention, which then led countries to adopt the Kyoto Protocol to the UNFCCC in 1997. The Kyoto Protocol, or the Protocol, is an international treaty that legally binds developed country parties or Annex I parties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It, however, contains no binding emission reduction commitments for non-Annex I parties. Basically, the Kyoto Protocol operationalized the UNFCCC as it committed industrialized countries to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions based on the principles of the UNFCCC, whereas the UNFCCC only encouraged countries to do so. Some of the key features of the Kyoto Protocol were that it was structured on the principles of the Convention. It also placed a heavier burden on developed countries under the central principle of the common but differentiated responsibility. Also, it only binds developed countries to emission reduction targets because it recognized their responsibility for the historical and current high levels of greenhouse gas emissions. Presently, 192 countries are parties to the Kyoto Protocol. But most significantly, the United States of America, which was the highest emitter of greenhouse gases at the time the protocol was signed, has not ratified the protocol till date. The Conference of Parties, or the COP, also serves as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. This is called the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, CMP. The CMP meets annually during the exact same period as the COP, and the first CMP was held in conjunction with the 11th session of the COP in 2005 at Montreal in Canada. The Kyoto Protocol has been divided into two significant commitment periods. The first commitment period applies to emissions between 2008 and 2012, and the second commitment period applies to emissions between 2013 and 2020. During the first commitment period, the protocol set binding emissions reduction targets for Annex 1 parties under the UNFCCC. The Kyoto Protocol, however, entered into force only on 16 February 2005 after a very long ratification period. You would notice that it was signed in the year 1997. The Kyoto also contains certain mechanisms which allows countries to reduce emissions. Although parties are bound to meet their emission reduction targets through domestic action, that is by reducing emissions onshore, the Kyoto Protocol allows parties to meet part of their targets through three other flexible market-based mechanisms that ideally encourage greenhouse gas abatement to start where it could be most cost-effective, for example, in the developing world. The three Kyoto mechanisms that we will next cover are the International Emissions Trading, the Clean Development Mechanism, and the Joint Implementation. Under the International Emissions Trading Mechanism, parties with commitments under the Kyoto Protocol have accepted targets for limiting or reducing emissions. These targets are expressed as levels of allowed emissions or assigned amounts over the first commitment period. The allowed emissions are further divided into assigned amount units or AAUs. Article 17 of the protocol envisages emissions tradings and allows countries that have emission units to spare, that is, emissions permitted for them but not used, to sell this excess capacity to countries that have gone over their targets. Therefore, the International Emissions Trading Mechanism created a new commodity in the form of carbon reduction or carbon removal. Therefore, carbon is now tracked or traded like any other commodity, and this is what is known as the carbon market. The second mechanism under the Kyoto is the Clean Development Mechanism. Under Article 12 of the protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism, or the CDM, allows a country with an emission reduction commitment to implement an emission reduction project in a developing country. These projects can in turn earn saleable certified emission reduction credits, each equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide, which can then be counted towards meeting their Kyoto targets. This mechanism stimulates sustainable development and emissions reduction while giving industrialized countries some flexibility in how they meet their emission reduction or limitation targets. For instance, a CDM project activity might involve a rural electrification project using solar panels or an installation of more energy efficient boiler in developing countries.